I served as the regional magistrate for Bavaria in 1890 when a telegram arrived from a village I'd never heard of. The message was brief and strange, composed in formal German that seemed oddly archaic for the modern telegraph system. It said the locals had captured something in the forest and needed official documentation of their discovery. The sender, a village elder named Hermann Adler, refused to describe what they'd caught over the wire. He only said I needed to see it myself and bring witnesses who could verify my observations. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The village was called Woldheim, which means forest home in English. I found it on old maps, tucked deep in the Bavarian wilderness, where the old trade roads had been abandoned decades before when the railway made them obsolete. The location sat in a valley surrounded by dense forest that had never been commercially logged. According to my maps, the nearest neighboring village was 15 miles away through difficult terrain. I brought 2 clerks and a photographer for the journey. The clerks, young men fresh from law school, saw this as an adventure rather than serious work. The photographer was more experienced, a middle-aged professional named Friedrich, who documented everything from royal weddings to industrial accidents. He'd brought 3 complete sets of equipment in case something failed, which told me he took this assignment more seriously than my clerks did. We traveled by train to the nearest station, a small depot that serviced the lumber industry operating farther north. From there, we hired a coach and driver who claimed to know the old roads that hadn't appeared on modern maps. The driver was reluctant when I told him our destination. He said Waldheim people kept to themselves and didn't welcome outsiders, especially government officials. But he agreed, after I doubled his fee and promised an additional bonus if he waited for our return. The coach took us down deteriorating roads for 6 hours. The forest pressed close on both sides, towering pines that had been growing since before Germany was unified. The road surface deteriorated steadily until we were barely moving, the coach wheels catching in deep ruts and holes that hadn't been maintained in years. Finally, around mid-afternoon, the driver refused to go further. He said the road ahead was completely impassable for wheeled vehicles, and we'd need to walk the remaining distance. We walked the final 3 miles on foot through dense pine forest that seemed to grow darker with each step, even though it was still afternoon. The trees were ancient, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't have circled them with linked arms. The canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into a perpetual twilight that made it difficult to judge the time. The air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and something else I couldn't quite identify. A musty animal scent that seemed to permeate everything. My clerks complained constantly about the distance and the weight of their document cases filled with official forms and legal papers. Friedrich said nothing as we walked, but I noticed he was observing everything with professional interest, the kind of attention that made me respect his experience. He stopped several times to examine unusual trees or rock formations, making notes in a small book he kept in his vest pocket. I didn't interrupt him because I'd noticed something that troubled me deeply. There were no birds singing in these woods, no squirrels chattering in the branches, no deer trails or rabbit runs visible in the undergrowth, no signs of normal forest life at all. The absence was striking once you noticed it, like standing in a room where everyone suddenly stops talking. I'd spent time in forests throughout Bavaria during investigations, and they'd always been full of animal sounds and movement. This forest was silent except for our footsteps. The silence was oppressive in a way that's hard to describe. Our footsteps on the forest floor, the rustling of our clothing, the breathing of 4 men exerting themselves, these were the only sounds. Even the wind seemed muted here, barely moving through the upper branches when it should have been creating constant whispers through the pine needles. It was the kind of silence that makes you want to whisper, though I couldn't have explained why. Waldheim appeared suddenly as we rounded a bend in the trail, emerging from the forest without any gradual transition. One moment we were surrounded by towering pines, and the next we could see buildings through the trees ahead. The village was larger than I'd expected from the sparse map notation, perhaps 40 structures arranged in a rough circle around a stone church that dominated the center of the settlement. The architecture was distinctly medieval, predating the modern building styles by several centuries, Half-timbered houses featured exposed wooden beams in geometric patterns against whitewashed walls that had been maintained despite their age. The roofs were steep, designed to shed heavy snow, covered in dark tiles that looked hand-cut. Everything about the construction suggested great age and careful preservation of traditional methods. But what struck me immediately was how defensive everything looked. The windows were narrow, more like arrow slits than proper windows meant to let in light. The doors were heavy timber reinforced with iron bands that looked more suited to a fortress than a farming village. Many buildings had small crosses carved into the lintels and door frames. Not the simple Christian symbol, but more elaborate designs that might have been older protective symbols incorporated into Christian practice. The whole village had the feeling of a fortification, a place built to keep something out rather than to welcome people in. The villagers came out to meet us as we approached the settlement proper, emerging from houses and workshops in response to some unspoken signal. About 60 people in total, ranging from elderly grandparents to small children who peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. They were dressed simply, in the practical clothing of farmers and tradespeople, nothing that marked them as unusual except for their uniformly wary expressions. But they all shared a similar appearance that I recognized from my years in law enforcement: fear, deep, exhausted fear that had been present for so long it had become part of their normal expressions. I'd seen this look on witnesses to prolonged crimes, on people living under threat, on communities terrorized by criminals. These people looked like they'd been under siege for months. I noticed other details as we walked into the village square. Dark circles under every adult's eyes, drawn faces suggesting weight loss from stress, a general sense of sleeplessness and constant strain. These people looked like they'd been working double shifts for weeks or living with an illness that wouldn't resolve. Children clung to their parents instead of running around playing. Adults kept glancing toward the forest edge as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. Herman Adler, the elder who'd sent the telegram, introduced himself with formal courtesy that seemed out of place given the obvious tension in the air. He was perhaps 70 years old, with white hair pulled back and tied in an old-fashioned style, and a full beard that reached halfway down his chest. His hands were gnarled from decades of farm work, with prominent veins and calluses that spoke of manual labor, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he spoke educated German with only a slight regional accent that suggested he'd had some formal schooling, which was unusual for a village this remote. Herman led us to the center of the village without preliminary explanation, walking with a straight-back dignity despite his age. He said we needed to see the situation first, then we could discuss the details and implications. I agreed, though I was becoming increasingly curious and somewhat concerned. The telegram had been strange enough with its vague references and urgent tone. The village's obvious fear was making me wonder what exactly we'd traveled all this way to document. That's when I saw the cage, and everything changed. It dominated the village square, positioned directly in front of the church steps where everyone would see it constantly. The structure was massive, clearly built with tremendous effort and resources that this small village could barely afford. The frame consisted of timber logs as thick as my torso, each one stripped of bark and smoothed carefully. They'd been lashed together with rope as thick as my wrist, the kind used on ocean-going ships to secure masts and spars. Iron bands reinforced every joint, and the whole structure was anchored to the ground, with iron stakes driven deep into the earth. The cage measured approximately 12 feet on each side and stood 8 feet tall, large enough to hold something substantial. The gaps between the logs were perhaps 6 inches wide, enough to see through clearly but too narrow for anything large to squeeze through or reach through effectively. The construction quality was impressive, showing careful planning and skilled execution. This wasn't something thrown together quickly in panic. This had been designed, engineered, built to hold something specific and dangerous. Inside the cage, sitting on its haunches in the center of the dirt floor, was a Dogman. That's the only word my mind could produce in that moment of first sight. I've spent my entire career dealing with facts, evidence, rational explanations for seemingly impossible situations. I'd prosecuted criminals who'd committed elaborate frauds. I'd investigated reports of supernatural events that turned out to have mundane explanations. I'd examined countless strange claims and found reasonable answers to all of them. But standing there in that village square, looking at the creature behind those bars, every rational explanation I might have constructed died before it could form fully in my mind. This was something beyond my experience, beyond my training, beyond the world I thought I understood, and I knew it immediately, with a certainty that bypassed rational analysis and went straight to instinctive recognition. The Dogman stood approximately 7 feet tall even in its hunched, resting posture, and I suspected it could reach 8 or 9 feet if it straightened to its full height. The body was humanoid in overall structure, clearly designed for walking upright on 2 legs rather than 4. The legs bent backward at the knee like a man's but were covered in thick fur and ended in large, almost paw-like feet, with visible claws that left deep marks in the dirt. The leg muscles were heavily developed, suggesting both tremendous strength for running and jumping and endurance for long-distance travel. The thighs were probably twice the diameter of a strong man's legs. The calves were equally muscular. This was a creature built for physical performance far beyond human capability, and just looking at it made me understand why the villagers were terrified. The torso was broader and deeper than any human's, with a barrel chest that housed lungs capable of sustained exertion. The shoulders were heavily muscled, suggesting upper body strength that could tear apart obstacles. The stomach was lean and tight, showing the definition of someone or something that lived an active, demanding life. There was no softness anywhere on this creature, just functional muscle and bone designed for survival. The arms were proportionally longer than human arms, hanging past where the knee would be when standing upright. They terminated in hands that were neither fully paw nor fully human hand, but something disturbing in between. 4 fingers and a thumb, arranged like human digits but covered in fur and tipped with thick yellowish claws that looked capable of tearing through wood or flesh with equal ease. The Dogman's fur was primarily gray and black, creating a pattern that would blend perfectly with shadows in the forest. The fur was thicker around the neck and shoulders, forming almost a mane, and thinner on the arms and legs where it wouldn't interfere with movement. Some patches looked matted and discolored, possibly with old blood from hunting or fighting. The overall appearance suggested a creature that lived rough, that spent its time in the deep forest without comfort or shelter, surviving through strength and cunning. But the head, that's what made this undeniably something beyond natural explanation and beyond any possibility of mistaken identity. The Dogman's head was unmistakably canine, very similar to a large wolf but subtly different in ways that were hard to articulate. The snout was long and powerful, filled with visible teeth even when the mouth was closed. The teeth were designed for tearing and crushing, carnivore teeth that left no doubt about this creature's diet. The ears were large and pointed, mobile and expressive, swiveling independently to track sounds from different directions. They moved constantly, monitoring our positions and movements, even when the Dogman's eyes were focused elsewhere. The nose was black and prominent, wet and obviously functional. I could see the nostrils flaring as it sampled our scents, learning about us through smell as much as sight. Every physical feature of the head said predator, said hunter, said something designed by nature to kill efficiently and survive in hostile environments. This should have been a creature to fear based purely on physical capability. But there was one feature that changed everything, that transformed this from a dangerous animal into something far more complex and disturbing. The eyes. The Dogman's eyes were positioned forward-facing like a human's, rather than set on the sides of the head, like a wolf's. This gave it binocular vision, depth perception, the ability to judge distances and movements with precision. But more than that, those eyes gleamed with an amber color that caught the afternoon light filtering through the clouds, and they held intelligence. Real, unmistakable intelligence of a kind that no animal should possess. Those eyes tracked our movement as we approached the cage. They studied us individually, moving from face to face, assessing each person. They noted the photographer's equipment and showed what looked like curiosity. They registered my official clothing and my position at the front of our group and seemed to understand what that meant. They understood. That was the inescapable conclusion. This dogman was conscious, aware, thinking in ways that went far beyond animal instinct. My photographer Friedrich dropped his equipment case at the site. The wooden box hit the cobblestones with a sharp crack and one of the brass latches broke, spilling several glass photographic plates onto the ground where they shattered. Friedrich didn't even notice the sound or the loss of expensive materials. He just stood there staring at the caged dogman with his mouth slightly open and his face gone pale. One of my clerks made a sound that was half gasp, half prayer, muttering something about saints and divine protection in a voice that shook. The other clerk had backed up several steps without seeming to realize he was moving, his document case held in front of his chest like a shield. They were both young men who'd probably never seen real danger in their comfortable legal careers, and they were completely unprepared for this. I forced myself to breathe slowly and evenly, to maintain the professional composure that decades of legal work had trained into me. My mind was racing through impossible explanations, trying to categorize what I was seeing into something that made sense. This couldn't be a bear dressed up or trained somehow. Bears don't sit upright in that posture. Bears don't have hands like that. Bears don't watch you with that kind of calculating intelligence. This couldn't be a deformed human being, someone with a medical condition that had twisted their body. No human deformity could produce that skull structure, that snout, those teeth, that fur. And no deformed human could survive in the wilderness hunting livestock. This couldn't be an elaborate hoax, some kind of costume or mechanism. The breathing was too natural. The small movements were too unconscious and fluid. The eyes held too much awareness. The dogman didn't make a sound as we stood there staring. It simply sat and watched us with patient attention, occasionally tilting its head slightly as if considering what we represented or what we might do next. The posture was relaxed but alert, ready to move if needed but not showing aggression. It looked like a person waiting patiently for something rather than an animal trapped in a cage. That observation disturbed me more than threatening behavior would have, because it suggested thought and planning rather than blind instinct. Hermann began explaining the situation in a quiet, controlled voice that contrasted sharply with the fear visible in his expression. He spoke like a man who'd rehearsed this story many times in his mind, who'd thought carefully about how to present impossible facts to skeptical authorities who might dismiss everything without investigation. The dogmen had been hunting their livestock for 3 months, he said, beginning in late spring when the sheep were first put out to pasture. It started with a single sheep that vanished from a fenced pasture during the night. They found the carcass 2 days later at the forest edge, drained of blood but otherwise intact. The killing was clean, surgical almost, not the messy attack of wolves or bears. The sheep had been positioned carefully on its side, with its legs extended, which seemed odd but not necessarily meaningful at the time. More attacks followed with increasing frequency over the following weeks. Goats next, 3 of them in a single night, then more sheep, sometimes 2 or 3 per week, then eventually a full-grown cow, which required tremendous strength to kill and drag. The animals weren't just killed and partially eaten like normal predation. They were systematically drained of blood through precise wounds and then arranged in patterns that clearly weren't random or accidental. The sheep were positioned in a circle, heads pointing inward. The goats formed a triangle, each one placed at a vertex. The cow was laid out with its legs pointing precisely to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Hermann demonstrated the patterns by arranging stones on the ground in front of us, and the geometric precision was unmistakable. This suggested ritual purpose rather than simple feeding behavior, some kind of deliberate message or practice. The villagers tried everything they could think of to stop the attacks or identify the predator. They organized hunting parties, groups of 8 or 10 armed men, who went into the forest with rifles and dogs during the day. They found tracks, enormous paw prints that seemed to shift between 4-footed locomotion and 2-footed walking. The tracks were unlike anything the experienced hunters recognized. Too large for wolves, wrong shape for bears, something else entirely. The dogs they brought refused to follow the scent trail effectively. They'd track for a short distance into the forest, then start whining and pulling back toward the village. Some of the dogs became aggressive toward their handlers. Others simply sat down and refused to move farther. The best tracking dogs, animals that had successfully hunted wolves and boars, couldn't be convinced to pursue this particular scent deep into the forest. They purchased steel traps from a merchant in the nearest town, heavy devices designed to hold bears and capable of breaking a man's leg. They set these traps along the forest edge where the attacks seemed to originate, baiting them with meat and concealing them under leaves. The dogmen found every single trap and tore them apart, bending the thick steel springs as if they were soft wire. They found the destroyed traps scattered in the forest, arranged in yet another pattern. A straight line pointing directly back toward the village church. A message, a warning, or perhaps a threat. They posted armed guards at night, rotating shifts so there were always 4 or 5 men watching the forest edge and the livestock pens. The guards reported seeing shapes moving between the trees, always just at the edge of their vision in the darkness. When they fired their rifles at these shapes, their bullets hit nothing but trees. They'd search the area in the morning and find no blood, no bodies, nothing to suggest they'd hit anything. The dogman was always one step ahead, always aware of their positions somehow, always gone before they could get a clear shot or confirm what they were seeing. The situation escalated dramatically when the dogman took a child from the village. Herman's voice became strained and rougher as he described this incident, clearly the most traumatic of all the events they'd experienced. A boy of 9 years old, the son of one of the farmers, had wandered too close to the forest edge at dusk, despite repeated warnings. His family had told him many times to stay away from the trees, but children don't always listen to warnings they don't understand or believe. The dogman emerged from the tree line without warning, moving on all fours with shocking speed that the witnesses said was faster than a running horse. It covered the 50 yards to the boy in seconds, snatched him up with one arm like he weighed nothing, and disappeared back into the forest before anyone could react or raise a weapon. The entire incident took perhaps 10 seconds from emergence to disappearance. The villagers heard the boy's screams for approximately 30 seconds, high and terrified, echoing through the valley with perfect clarity in the evening air. They were mobilizing to pursue, grabbing weapons and torches when the screaming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming had been, because it suggested the worst possible outcome. They searched through the night with every able-bodied person in the village, but found nothing in the darkness. They found the boy the next morning at the exact spot where he'd been taken. He was lying on the ground, alive, and physically unharmed. No injuries visible on his body, no wounds, no scratches or bruises. His clothes were dirty but intact. Physically, he seemed completely fine, but he was changed in ways that couldn't be seen or measured. He wouldn't speak, not a single word. He wouldn't eat, refusing food and water. He wouldn't respond to his parents' voices or touch or anything else. He just sat and stared at the forest with wide, unblinking eyes that seemed to see something the rest of them couldn't. That's when the village elders held an emergency meeting and made the decision that Herman was still clearly conflicted about. They would use the boy as bait to capture the dogman. They reasoned that the creature had taken the boy but returned him unharmed, which suggested some kind of connection or purpose beyond simple predation. Whatever the dogman wanted with the boy, it might return, and they could be ready. I felt my stomach turn at this admission. The idea of using a traumatized child as bait for a dangerous predator. It was unconscionable from a legal and moral standpoint, but Herman saw my expression and quickly explained they'd kept the boy completely safe, never in actual danger. They'd placed him in a small clearing just inside the forest edge, but surrounded the area with 15 armed men, hidden in carefully prepared positions. The boy was protected by multiple layers of defense, and they'd been prepared to abandon the attempt if it seemed too dangerous. The Dogman came on the second night of waiting. It approached cautiously, more slowly than when it had taken the boy initially, moving through the trees in a way that suggested it knew this might be a trap, but came anyway. When it reached the clearing where the boy sat, it stood upright to its full height and approached slowly. It reached out one of those strange hybrid hands toward the child, not threateningly but almost gently. That's when they sprang their trap. Herman didn't detail exactly how they'd captured it, and I decided not to press for specific techniques at that moment. He only said they'd prepared carefully, using knowledge passed down through generations about dealing with dangerous forest creatures. Heavy nets weighted with iron chains, hooks attached to ropes anchored to trees. A coordinated assault by 15 men working together with practiced precision. The Dogman had fought, he admitted. It had injured 3 men, breaking bones and causing wounds that would take months to heal. But they'd overwhelmed it through sheer numbers, planning and desperation. They'd built the cage around it while it was still restrained by nets and chains, working through an entire day and night without stopping to construct the prison while they had the Dogman contained. The creature had been conscious for most of this, watching them work with those intelligent eyes, but it hadn't tried to escape once the initial capture was complete. It had simply sat there, bound by nets and chains, and watched them build its cage with what Herman described as resignation. That detail disturbed him, I could tell. The Dogman's acceptance suggested understanding rather than animal defeat. That had been 3 days before I received the telegram. Herman had waited to contact authorities because he'd needed time to think about what this capture meant, what it revealed, what questions would be asked by outsiders. He'd chosen to contact me specifically because my reputation included a willingness to investigate unusual cases seriously rather than dismissing them out of hand. He'd heard about several cases where I'd pursued investigations that other magistrates had written off as superstition or fraud. I approached the cage carefully, maintaining professional distance while getting close enough to observe details. The Dogman watched me but didn't move or make any threatening gestures. It simply observed my approach with those remarkable eyes. Up close I could see more details that made the creature even more impossible and disturbing. The fur was genuine. Growing from skin I could see in patches where the fur was thinner. Not a costume, not attached somehow. Real fur growing from real skin. The claws were natural, integrated into the structure of the fingers and toes. Each claw was yellowish-brown and showed wear patterns suggesting regular use for digging, climbing, or fighting. The teeth were genuine canines designed for tearing meat, set in jaws with tremendous bite force based on the visible muscle attachments. Every detail said this was a real creature, not a hoax or illusion or mistake. But the eyes kept drawing my attention away from the physical details. I'd spent my career studying people, reading their expressions, understanding their intentions through observation. I'd interviewed hundreds of criminals and witnesses. I'd learned to see through deception and recognize genuine emotion. And looking into the Dogman's eyes, I saw awareness that matched or exceeded human consciousness. It knew we were discussing its fate. It understood its situation with perfect clarity, and it was waiting for something with patient intelligence. Friedrich finally recovered enough composure to retrieve his undamaged equipment and begin the documentation process. Photography was still relatively new technology in 1890, requiring careful setup and precise technique. He had to prepare chemical plates in a portable dark tent. He had to calculate exposure times based on the available light. He had to position the heavy camera on its tripod and make fine adjustments to focus and framing. The entire process took about 20 minutes per photograph, and during that time the Dogman watched with obvious curiosity. It tracked Friedrich's movements. It observed the equipment setup with attention that suggested trying to understand purpose and function. When Friedrich finally took the first photograph, the flash powder created a bright explosion of light and a cloud of acrid smoke. Any animal should have startled, should have jumped, or shown fear of the sudden noise and brightness. The Dogman didn't flinch. It simply blinked its eyes against the brightness, much like a person would, and continued staring directly at the camera. Friedrich took 12 photographs from different angles over the course of 2 hours. The Dogman cooperated fully with each one, even turning its head when Friedrich gestured that he wanted a profile shot. It understood what was being asked and complied. That level of cooperation was harder to explain than any physical feature. We spent the rest of the afternoon documenting everything with obsessive thoroughness. I measured the cage dimensions precisely, recording them in my official notebook. 12 feet 3 inches by 12 feet 1 inch by 8 feet 4 inches. Interior height sufficient for the Dogman to stand fully upright, with perhaps 6 inches of clearance. I described the construction materials and methods in detail, noting the rope thickness, the iron band placement and dimensions, the anchor points driven into the ground. I wanted every aspect recorded because I knew this documentation would be questioned extensively by people who hadn't been here. I examined the Dogman from every angle the cage would allow, circling the structure multiple times and making detailed observations from different positions. I described its physical characteristics in clinical, objective terms as if I were documenting any other legal case. Height approximately 7 feet in resting posture, estimated 8 to 9 feet at full extension. Weight estimated at 300 to 350 pounds based on visible muscle mass and body structure. Fur coloration predominantly gray-black with lighter patches on the chest and inner arms. Claws measuring 3 inches in length on hands, slightly shorter on feet. Teeth visible through lips even when mouth closed, clearly designed for carnivorous diet. Musculature consistent with both bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion, suggesting versatility in movement. I interviewed 12 villagers who'd personally seen the creature during the 3 months of attacks, taking detailed statements from each one and having my clerks transcribe everything verbatim. Their descriptions were remarkably consistent across different witnesses who'd seen the Dogman under different conditions. They all described the same basic physical features. They all mentioned the upright posture and human-like movement. They all emphasized the intelligence visible in the eyes. They all stated unequivocally that this was no bear or wolf or any natural animal they'd encountered in decades of living adjacent to the forest. Several of the older villagers used words like demon or forest spirit or cursed creature when describing the Dogman, but Hermann consistently corrected them, insisting this was something physical and real rather than supernatural. He seemed determined to frame this in rational terms, as a flesh and blood creature rather than something mystical, though I wasn't sure his distinction held up given what we were looking at. My clerks transcribed the statements while I conducted interviews, their pens scratching across paper as farmers and tradespeople described their encounters. An old woman who'd seen the Dogman standing at her fence line at dawn, watching her house for several minutes before disappearing. A young man who'd watched it kill a sheep with his own eyes, describing the precise bite to the throat and the way it had arranged the body afterward. A family who'd heard it moving across their roof one night. The heavy footsteps overhead impossible to mistake for any normal animal. Each testimony added to the mounting evidence that this was real and that their fear was completely justified. Night fell while we worked, the shadows lengthening across the village square until the sun disappeared behind the western mountains. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I was grateful for my heavy coat. The villagers lit torches and placed them in iron holders that had been installed in a ring around the cage, creating a circle of firelight that pushed back the darkness and provided enough illumination to continue our work. But I noticed that people didn't like being near the Dogman after dark. Even with it caged and apparently helpless, with thick bars between them and any possible danger, they maintained a careful distance of at least 20 feet. Only Hermann and 3 or 4 of the village elders stayed close to the cage after sunset, watching the creature with expressions that mixed fear with something else I couldn't quite identify initially. Guilt, perhaps, or regret, or recognition of something they understood but weren't ready to explain to outsiders. That's when everything changed, fundamentally. That's when the Dogman spoke for the first time. The sound came without warning, a voice emerging from that canine throat in a way that should have been impossible. The vocal apparatus was clearly not designed for human speech. The sounds were distorted, rough, like gravel being dragged across metal, but the words were unmistakably German. Broken German, heavily accented German produced by a mouth not meant for those sounds, but comprehensible German nonetheless. Water, the Dogman said. That single word hung in the air, like something physical, shocking everyone into absolute stillness. Then it repeated the request, adding more words slowly and with obvious effort. Thirsty. Need water. Please. That last word, spoken with such obvious effort and such unexpected courtesy, sent chills down my spine. This creature was asking for help using human social conventions. It understood politeness. It understood how to request rather than demand. It understood that we might respond better to courtesy than to aggression. The villagers reacted with immediate panic that bordered on chaos. Several people screamed outright. Others ran toward their homes without looking back. Some grabbed weapons, rifles and pitchforks and axes, as if the Dogman's speech somehow made it more dangerous than it had been moments before. Herman shouted for calm, his voice rising above the panic, but I could see his hands shaking badly. His face had gone pale. This was new, clearly. The Dogman had never spoken before. It had waited until official witnesses were present before revealing this capability. I stepped closer to the cage, ignoring the urgent warnings from my clerks who were backing away rapidly. My hands were shaking too, I'll admit that. But I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to know if this was real speech or some kind of imitation. I asked the Dogman directly, speaking slowly and clearly. "What are you? Where did you come from?" The creature looked at me with those intelligent amber eyes and took a long moment before responding. I could see it thinking, could see it considering how to answer. When it spoke again, the words came with more fluency, as if speaking was becoming easier with practice. Human once, it said, each word carefully formed despite the difficulty. This village, long ago, hunter. Then it stopped speaking, as if the effort had exhausted it or as if it had decided that was enough information for now. But it had said enough. The implications were staggering and horrifying. This creature claimed to have been human, from this very village. A hunter who'd been transformed somehow into what I was looking at now. The claim raised 1,000 questions. How? When? Why? Was this literally true, or some kind of metaphor or delusion? But the Dogman's expression suggested it meant exactly what it had said. I turned to Herman, whose expression had shifted from fear to something closer to resignation or acceptance. I asked him directly if he knew what the Dogman was talking about. The old man was silent for a long moment. The other villagers who remained nearby were watching him, waiting for his response. Some looked expectant, some looked afraid. All of them seemed to know this moment had been coming. Finally, Herman nodded slowly and gestured toward the church. "We need to talk privately," he said. "All of the elders. There are things about this village that outsiders don't know. Things we've kept secret for generations." I agreed immediately. Whatever was happening here required a full explanation before I could make any official determination about what to do with the Dogman. We left 6 armed guards posted around the cage and moved into the church, where oil lamps were lit, and we gathered around a heavy wooden table that looked like it had been there for centuries. The table bore deep scratches and stains that suggested hundreds of years of use. Herman sat at the head, with 4 other elders taking positions along the sides. I sat opposite Herman, with my clerks beside me, our notebooks ready to record whatever we were about to hear. Herman began explaining the village's hidden history, speaking in a low voice as if the walls might be listening and judging. Waldheim was much older than official records suggested, he said. The church itself dated back to the 11th century, built when this region was being Christianized. But the settlement predated the church by hundreds of years. Long before Christianity came to Bavaria, the people here had practiced older beliefs, forest beliefs, nature worship, rituals designed to maintain balance between human settlement and the wild forces that surrounded them. These weren't evil practices, Herman emphasized. They were survival strategies developed over centuries of living on the edge of vast wilderness. The forest held dangers that Christianity couldn't address or protect against. Wolves, bears, other things that were harder to name or explain. The people needed protection beyond what prayers could provide. So they made arrangements, agreements, covenants with the forest itself, if you want to think of it that way. One of those arrangements involved selecting a guardian every 40 years. According to traditions that stretch back before anyone could remember, the village would choose someone to protect them. Always a hunter, someone who knew the forest intimately, someone strong and skilled and brave, someone willing to make a tremendous sacrifice for the community. They would perform a ritual in the deep forest, at standing stones that predated even the earliest settlement, speaking words in a language so old that even the ritual keepers no longer fully understood their meaning. The ritual would transform the chosen hunter into a Dogman. The transformation was permanent for the duration of the service period, which lasted exactly 40 years. During that time, the Dogman would patrol the forest around the village. It would keep predators away from livestock and people. It would warn of approaching dangers, whether natural or otherwise. It would mark territory boundaries that other creatures would respect. It would serve as the bridge between the human settlement and the wild forces that surrounded them, maintaining balance between civilization and wilderness. For 40 years, the Dogman would live alone in the forest. It would maintain a territory of several square miles around the village, marking boundaries with scent and claw marks that other forest creatures understood and respected. It would hunt game to sustain itself, though it would never take from the village's livestock unless the village failed to leave offerings at certain times. It would remain close enough to protect but far enough to avoid frightening the villagers, who would see it only rarely. And at the end of 40 years, when its service was complete, the village would perform another ritual. This second ritual was supposed to reverse the transformation, returning the Dogman to fully human form. The guardian would emerge from the forest, would be welcomed back into the community with honors and respect, would live out its remaining years as a revered elder. Then, in time, a new hunter would be chosen, and the cycle would continue as it had for uncounted generations. That's how it had always worked, Herman explained, for as long as anyone could remember or trace through oral tradition. Century after century, the village had maintained this covenant. Every 40 years, like clockwork, a new guardian would be chosen and an old one restored. The system had protected Waldheim through wars, famines, plagues, every crisis that had destroyed neighboring villages. Waldheim endured because it maintained the old agreements, but this time was catastrophically different. The current Dogman had completed its 40 years of service exactly as prescribed. Herman counted the years carefully on his fingers as he explained. The transformation had occurred in 1850, which meant the term had ended in 1890, just a few months before we arrived. The Dogman had returned to the forest edge right on schedule, waiting for the village to perform the restoration ritual that would return it to human form. But the village had failed completely. The problem, Herman explained with obvious shame, was that the knowledge had been lost or deliberately abandoned. The village had changed dramatically over those 40 years. The old beliefs had faded as new generations embraced modernity and Christian orthodoxy more completely. The young people no longer believed in the old ways, dismissing them as superstition better left in the past. The elders who remembered the complete ritual had died, taking critical knowledge with them to their graves. Herman's grandfather had been the primary ritual keeper, the one responsible for maintaining and transmitting the sacred knowledge. But he'd died 15 years ago after a fall from a roof he'd been repairing. He'd tried to teach Herman the words and procedures while Herman was still young, but Herman admitted with bitter regret that he'd been skeptical and inattentive. He'd thought it was all just old stories, harmless traditions that didn't really matter. He hadn't memorized everything properly. He hadn't taken it seriously enough to preserve the knowledge intact. Now that he desperately needed that knowledge, Herman found himself with only fragments, pieces of the ritual, hints at what should be done, but not enough to attempt the transformation safely. And without the complete ritual, attempting it might kill the Dogman or trap it in some worse state. The risk was too great, so they'd done nothing, hoping somehow that the knowledge would resurface, or that the Dogman would simply accept its fate. The Dogman had waited at the forest edge for weeks, Herman said. It had made its presence known without attacking anyone or causing damage. It had waited patiently, giving them time to remember their obligation and prepare the ritual. But as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, it must have realized that the village either couldn't or wouldn't perform the restoration. The covenant had been broken. The promise would not be kept. That's when it began taking livestock. Not from hunger, Herman was certain. The dogmen could hunt deer and wild boar easily enough. It took livestock as messages, as statements, as increasingly desperate attempts to get the village's attention and force them to address what they'd done. The arranged carcasses weren't random or meaningless. They were communications from someone who'd lost the ability to speak but still needed to be heard. The sheep arranged in a circle represented the cycle that should have been completed but had been broken. The goats in a triangle represented the three-part covenant between hunter, village, and guardian that the ritual was meant to maintain. The cow, with its legs pointing to the cardinal directions, represented the 4 decades of service that had been rendered faithfully and should have been honored. Every arrangement was symbolic, meant to remind the village of what they'd forgotten or chosen to ignore. And the child. I asked specifically about taking the boy, wanting to understand that incident. Herman's face showed deep pain as he explained. The dogman hadn't hurt the child at all. Instead, it had carried him gently deep into the forest to a place the villagers avoided, a clearing where ancient standing stones marked the ritual site. The dogman had shown the boy those stones, shown him the carvings on them, shown him the evidence that the old ways were real, that the stories were true, that magic still existed in the world. The boy couldn't speak about what he'd seen because he was too young to process such a fundamental challenge to his understanding of reality. He'd witnessed something that contradicted everything he'd been taught about how the world works. He'd seen proof that the old stories weren't just stories, that the rituals were real, that adults had been lying about what was possible. The trauma wasn't from being kidnapped by a monster. It was from learning that everything he'd been told was incomplete or false. More than that, Herman suspected the boy had seen something else during those hours in the forest. Perhaps the dogman had shown him memories somehow. Perhaps he'd seen the transformation ritual, experienced it vicariously, understood what had been done to create this creature. Perhaps he'd seen the man the dogman had been 40 years ago, young and strong and willing to sacrifice himself. The boy's silence suggested he'd learned truths too heavy for a child to carry. I felt physically sick listening to this explanation. The legal implications were complex and challenging, but the moral implications were devastating. This wasn't a monster they'd caged. This was a man who'd made an enormous sacrifice for his community, who'd given up 40 years of his life to protect people, who'd endured 4 decades as a creature rather than a human being. And when that service was complete, when he'd earned his restoration, the village had failed him. I asked Herman directly why they'd captured the dogman instead of trying desperately to find the lost ritual knowledge. Why had they chosen imprisonment over attempting restoration? His answer was brutally honest. It was easier, he admitted. Easier to treat it as a monster than to acknowledge what they'd done. Easier to cage it and call in authorities than to admit they'd broken a covenant that stretched back hundreds of years. Easier to pretend it was a dangerous animal than to face the guilt of their betrayal. Some of the elders had resisted the decision to capture the dogman, Herman said. There had been arguments that lasted for hours. Several people had argued that the village should be trying to restore the dogman, rather than imprisoning it. They'd searched through old documents in the church archives, looking for any record of the ritual words. They'd interviewed the oldest residents, hoping someone remembered details their parents or grandparents had mentioned. They'd found fragments, pieces, hints of what should be done, but not enough to attempt the transformation safely. They'd been deadlocked until the dogman took the child. That action had tipped the balance. Fear overwhelmed conscience. The majority voted to capture rather than restore, and the decision was made. Now they had a caged creature and no plan for what to do with it. Hence the telegram to me, asking for official intervention or guidance or permission to do something they couldn't decide for themselves. We returned to the village square after this conversation. The night had grown darker, the torches casting flickering shadows that made everything seem unreal. The dogman was waiting exactly as before, sitting on its haunches in the center of the cage. But now I understood. Now I could see the man inside the creature. Now I recognized the tragedy of the situation. I approached the cage directly and spoke to the dogman as a person rather than an animal. I asked if what Herman had told me was true. The dogman nodded slowly, a distinctly human gesture that looked strange performed by that canine head. Then it spoke again, its voice stronger now, as if speaking had become easier with practice or as if it had decided to trust us with more information. 40 years, the dogman said, the words coming more fluidly now, served them faithfully, protected them, kept the wolves away, kept the wild things back, alone, always alone. Then the words came faster, with less evident physical effort, emotions breaking through. They promised to bring me back, to make me human again, to honor the covenant, but they forgot, or they chose to forget, or they stopped believing. The result is the same. I am abandoned. I asked what the dogman wanted now. What could be done to address this situation? The creature was silent for a long moment, those amber eyes studying me as if assessing whether I could be trusted with an honest answer. Finally it spoke again. Justice, it said simply. I want what was promised. Want my life back. Want to be human before I die. But if they cannot restore me, if the knowledge is truly lost, then I want them to remember. Want them to tell their children what betrayal looks like. Want them to know the cost of broken promises. Want them to teach honor and obligation, not just take oaths and abandon them. I made my decision in that moment. I told Herman and the gathered villagers, my voice loud enough to carry across the square, that I was ordering the dogman's immediate release. Several people objected loudly and angrily. They argued it was dangerous, that it had killed their livestock, that it had threatened their children, that releasing it would invite further attacks. They demanded I fulfill my duty to protect them from threats. I cut them off with more force than I usually employed in official duties. This creature, I said, deliberately emphasizing that word over animal or monster, has honored a contract for 40 years. It gave up its human form voluntarily. It lived in isolation and hardship. It protected this village from threats you don't even know about, because it dealt with them before they reached you. It kept bears away from your livestock. It warned away raiders and bandits. It maintained order in the forest that allowed your village to survive. And when its service was complete, when it had earned restoration, you failed to honor your end of the agreement. That's not monster behavior. That's human betrayal. The livestock killings were messages, not predation, I explained. Carefully constructed communications from someone who'd lost the ability to speak your language initially. The child was shown truth, not harmed, not a scratch on him. Every action this dogman has taken has been measured, calculated, designed to force acknowledgement rather than to cause real harm. Compare that to your actions. You captured a being who served you faithfully and put it in a cage like a common animal. You denied its humanity. You refused to honor a sacred covenant. Who is the monster in this situation? Herman agreed with me, though I could see the decision cost him greatly to say publicly. Several of the other elders nodded reluctantly, acknowledging the truth even though it shamed them. The younger villagers looked uncertain, caught between traditional fear of the dogman and growing recognition of injustice. Some of them looked at their parents with questions in their eyes, wondering what else they'd been lied to about. Herman ordered the cage opened, his voice carrying the authority of his position. It took time. The men moved slowly, fearfully, to remove the iron bands and untie the complex knots in the thick ropes. The work required nearly an hour of sustained effort. The dogman sat perfectly still throughout the process, watching with patient eyes but making no threatening moves. It seemed content to wait for its freedom rather than trying to escape prematurely. When the last rope was removed and the door section of the cage was lifted away, creating an opening large enough for the dogman to exit comfortably, the creature stood to its full height for the first time since we'd arrived. It looked even more imposing at full extension, at least 8 feet tall, perhaps closer to 9. The villagers backed away instinctively, creating a clear path to the forest that was 20 feet wide at the narrowest point. But the dogman didn't immediately take that path to freedom. It turned slowly in place, looking at each person gathered in the square with deliberate attention, making eye contact with as many people as possible, making sure every single person saw it clearly and understood what they were witnessing. This wasn't an animal escaping. This was a person leaving, exiling itself from a community that had failed to honor its promises. Then the Dogman turned to me specifically. It approached to within a few feet, close enough that I could smell the wild scent of its fur, could see the individual hairs and the old scars that marked its hide. It looked down at me from its considerable height, and I looked up into those remarkable amber eyes. I saw gratitude there for being heard and believed, but I also saw sadness so profound that it made my chest physically ache. The Dogman wasn't just sad, it was heartbroken. "Thank you," the Dogman said, its voice rough but clear. Someone listened, someone saw, someone acknowledged the truth. It paused, gathering thoughts or perhaps emotions, then continued. "I will leave now. We'll go deep into the forest where humans never travel. We'll not return to this village. We'll not threaten them again. We'll live out whatever remains of this cursed life in solitude. But they must remember. They must tell their children. They must teach them what promises mean, what honor means, what betrayal costs, what covenants demand." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. The Dogman reached out one of those hybrid hands and gently touched my shoulder, a gesture so human and so gentle that tears came to my eyes despite my professional training. Then it turned away from me and walked toward the forest edge, where the darkness waited between the ancient pines. The crowd parted completely now, giving the Dogman a path 20 feet wide. Nobody wanted to be close. Some people looked ashamed now that the decision was made. Some looked afraid still. Most looked both. Children clung to their parents and stared with wide eyes that would remember this night for the rest of their lives. The Dogman moved on all fours as it approached the tree line, its gait fluid and powerful, and very much like the animal the villagers had feared. It looked wild and dangerous, every inch the predator. But just before it reached the deep shadows under the pines, it stopped one final time. It stood upright, rising to its full imposing height, and turned back to look at us all one last time. In that moment, lit by flickering torchlight with the ancient forest behind it, I saw clearly the man it had been 40 years ago. I saw the pride of someone who'd served faithfully. I saw the strength of someone who'd endured incredible hardship. I saw the sacrifice that had been made willingly for the community's protection, and I saw the betrayal that had been inflicted upon that sacrifice. The image burned itself into my memory with perfect clarity. I knew I would carry that image until the day I died. Then the Dogman dropped to all fours again and disappeared into the darkness between the trees. We heard it moving for perhaps a full minute, branches breaking, leaves rustling, the sound of something large moving with purpose and speed through dense forest. Then silence fell completely, broken only by the crackling of torches and the quiet sobbing of several villagers who'd finally allowed themselves to feel the full weight of what they'd done. I stayed in Waldheim for 3 more days, completing my official documentation with thorough precision. My report was careful and clinical in its language where possible. I described the creature in scientific terms as much as I could. I included precise measurements and observations. I documented the villagers' statements about the months of livestock predation and the child's kidnapping. Friedrich's photographs would provide visual evidence that couldn't be dismissed as hallucination or fraud. But I also included Hermann's full explanation of the ritual tradition with all its details. I documented the covenant between village and guardian. I recorded the broken promise and the 40 years of faithful service that had been betrayed. I included statements from multiple elders confirming the tradition. I made it absolutely clear in my report that this was not a simple case of a dangerous animal requiring elimination. This was a profoundly complex situation involving tradition, sacred obligation, and fundamental injustice. When I returned to Munich and submitted my report, my superiors read it with increasing disbelief and barely concealed anger. They called me to the administrative offices for a meeting that I knew would be unpleasant. 3 senior officials sat me down in a formal conference room and demanded that I explain myself. How could I, a rational magistrate trained in law and procedure, submit a report that included supernatural transformation rituals and talking wolf creatures? Had I lost my mind? Been drugged? Succumbed to local superstition? I showed them Friedrich's photographs, which had developed perfectly and showed the Dogman clearly from multiple angles. The officials examined them carefully, passing the prints between them with expressions of deep confusion and concern. They could see this wasn't a bear or a large dog. They could see it wasn't a deformed human. They could see the cage and the villagers and the impossible reality of what we'd documented. The evidence was literally in their hands, but they couldn't accept it. Or more accurately, they wouldn't accept it because accepting it would challenge too many assumptions about reality. They asked me, then ordered me, then finally demanded that I revise the report, remove the supernatural elements, explain this as a case of mistaken identity or mass delusion or elaborate fraud, provide a rational explanation that wouldn't embarrass the government or challenge people's understanding of natural law, anything but what I'd actually witnessed and recorded. I refused absolutely and without qualification. I'd seen what I'd seen with my own eyes. I'd heard what I'd heard with my own ears. I'd touched the cage that held the creature. I'd looked into eyes that held unmistakable intelligence and consciousness. The Dogman was real. The ritual was real. The betrayal was real. All of it deserved accurate documentation regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. The officials made it explicitly clear that insisting on this version of events would end my career permanently. I would never work as a magistrate again. My reputation would be destroyed. Other professionals would avoid me. My family might suffer socially. Everything I'd worked for would be gone. Did I understand the consequences of my decision? I told them I understood completely and accepted all consequences. Truth mattered more than career advancement. Justice mattered more than reputation or social standing. I would not falsify my report to make it more palatable to people who hadn't been there and hadn't seen what I'd seen. I would not betray the Dogman the way Waldheim had. I would not break faith. They were silent for a long moment after I said that. Then they informed me that my report would be archived in a restricted file that few people would ever access. They strongly suggested I take an extended leave of absence from my position, a suggestion that carried the unmistakable weight of command. I submitted my formal resignation instead, effective immediately. I was 42 years old and my career as a government magistrate was finished. But my conscience was clear and I could face myself in the mirror. I spent several years afterward researching similar cases privately, traveling through Bavaria and into neighboring regions. I collected stories from remote villages about creatures that walked upright, that seemed part human and part wolf or bear. Most of these stories were vague, second-hand accounts impossible to verify, old legends told by elderly people who'd heard them from their grandparents. But occasionally I found details that suggested Waldheim might not be completely unique. An old woman in an alpine village told me about her grandfather who disappeared into the mountains for decades, then returned briefly as something changed before disappearing again forever. A forester in Austria mentioned finding standing stones deep in the wilderness where the trees grew in unusual patterns and animals behaved strangely. A scholar in Prague had collected medieval documents describing transformation rituals used by various forest communities throughout Central Europe. None of it was conclusive. None of it would satisfy academic standards of proof, but the patterns suggested something real beneath the legends. The photographs from Waldheim were destroyed in a fire at the Munich archive in 1902, 12 years after the events. A clerk knocked over an oil lamp supposedly, and the entire section containing unusual cases was consumed before anyone could respond effectively. Very convenient for those who wanted the Dogman forgotten. My written report survived only because I'd kept personal copies in multiple locations. But without the photographic evidence, it became easier for officials to dismiss the whole thing as fantasy or delusion. I gave my copies of the report and all my research notes to a monastery archive in 1910, instructing them not to open the sealed box until after my death. I wanted the information preserved for history, but also wanted to avoid causing problems for people still living. Herman and several other Waldheim villagers were still alive when I made that decision, and I didn't want them facing official investigation or punishment. Waldheim itself still exists, though it's much smaller now than it was in 1890. The young people left as soon as they were old enough, drawn to cities and modern opportunities that rural life couldn't match. The forest has reclaimed some of the outlying buildings. The church still stands but holds services only once a month when an aging priest makes the journey from a larger town. The place is dying slowly, and perhaps that's appropriate. I visited Waldheim one final time in 1920, exactly 30 years after the Dogman's release. Only a dozen people still lived there, all elderly. Herman had died years before from natural causes. None of the remaining villagers would discuss what had happened in 1890 when I tried to ask follow-up questions. They changed the subject. They claimed not to remember. They insisted it had all been mass hysteria or misunderstanding. The silence was deliberate and complete. But I noticed something as I walked through the abandoned parts of the village. Several of the empty houses had small shrines built near their doorways. Simple wooden structures containing offerings of food, flowers, carved figures that looked distinctly canine. Someone was still honoring the old traditions in secret. Someone still remembered what the village had lost and what they owed. Someone was keeping faith even if they couldn't speak about it openly. I've thought about that Dogman often over the decades since. I'm an old man now, writing this final account in 1924. I'm 86 years old, and my memory fails me in most areas. I forget names of people I've known for years. I forget what I did yesterday. But I remember that night in Waldheim with perfect crystalline clarity. I remember every detail as if it happened this morning. I remember the intelligent amber eyes looking at me with emotions too complex for any animal to feel. I remember the rough voice speaking broken German through a throat not designed for human speech. I remember the dignity with which the Dogman accepted its permanent exile from human society. I remember the grief in its posture as it stood at the forest edge one final time before disappearing forever. I wonder if it's still alive. Dogmen might live longer than humans for all I know. The transformation might have extended its lifespan beyond normal human limits. It could be living still in some remote part of the Bavarian forest, surviving alone, remembering a time when it was human and had a name and a family and a community that valued its existence. Or perhaps it found others like itself. Perhaps the old traditions continued in secret in other isolated villages. Perhaps there are other guardians still serving faithfully, still waiting for transformations that will never come because the knowledge has been lost everywhere. Or perhaps the Dogman died years ago, finally succumbing to age or injury or simple loneliness that slowly consumed its will to continue. Perhaps its body lies somewhere in the deep forest, bones scattered and overgrown, returning to the earth it protected for so long. Perhaps the trees grew over those bones, and the forest reclaimed what had once been one of its most faithful guardians. Perhaps that's the closest thing to peace it could find. I hope the villagers told their children the truth eventually. I hope the story became part of Waldheim's oral history, passed down through generations with all its uncomfortable implications intact. I hope young people growing up there learned about promises and honor and the cost of betrayal. I hope they learned that covenants matter, that obligations must be kept, that service deserves recognition and reward. But I suspect none of that happened. I suspect the story was buried, forgotten, dismissed as superstition from a more ignorant time that modern people had outgrown. That's the real tragedy of what I witnessed in 1890. Not that such creatures as Dogman exist, though that challenges everything science tells us about biology and possibility. Not that villages once had magical guardians created through ancient rituals, though that challenges everything we think we know about history and human development. The real tragedy is that we forgot these covenants. We chose convenience over honor. We chose modernity over sacred obligation. We chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth. We abandoned those who served us. The Dogman served faithfully for 40 years. It endured transformation, isolation, and hardship beyond what most humans could survive. It protected people who would eventually betray it completely. It honored a covenant that the village failed to honor in return. And when it demanded justice, when it asked only for what had been promised, it was caged like a dangerous animal. When it told the truth about what had been done, that truth was suppressed and hidden. When it accepted exile with remarkable dignity, that dignity was forgotten within a generation. I've spent my life working in law, trying to ensure justice prevails, and that truth is documented accurately. But the Dogman of Waldheim received no justice from the system. It received no acknowledgement from the authorities. It received exile and obscurity, and the slow death of being forgotten. Its enormous sacrifice was dismissed. Its faithful service was denied. The covenant it honored was broken without consequence to those who broke it, and that betrayal was never officially recognized or punished. If there are still dogmen in the deep German forests, and I believe with all my heart that there might be, then perhaps we should ask ourselves what we did to create them and what we owe them now. What promises did our ancestors make that we've forgotten? What covenants do we still carry even if we don't remember making them? What faithful servants are we betraying through our convenient amnesia? What obligations are we ignoring because acknowledging them would be uncomfortable? The Dogman wasn't born a monster, wasn't created evil. It was made a guardian through ritual and willing sacrifice. It accepted transformation and isolation to protect a community it believed would honor their promises. And it was kept from returning to humanity through cowardice and forgetfulness and the casual cruelty of broken faith. That's the shocking truth that was revealed in 1890 when a German village caged a dogman. Not that monsters are real, but that we create them through our broken promises and our refusal to honor sacred obligations. I'll die soon. My health is failing steadily, and I've lived longer than I expected or perhaps deserve. But I wanted this story recorded properly and completely before I go. I wanted someone to know what really happened in Waldheim. I wanted the Dogman's sacrifice acknowledged in writing that would survive me. I wanted its betrayal documented by someone who witnessed it directly. It deserves that much, at least. It deserves to be remembered as a person who served faithfully, rather than as a monster that was caged and forgotten. Somewhere in the deep Bavarian forest, if the Dogman still lives, it remembers. It remembers being human and having a name. It remembers the transformation ritual and the pain and fear of becoming something else. It remembers 40 years of faithful service, protecting people who would betray it. It remembers the village that broke its promise. It remembers waiting at the forest edge for weeks, hoping they would remember their obligation. It remembers the disappointment when they didn't. That memory should be shared. That truth should be told. That story should not be forgotten. The greatest monsters are not the ones that walk on two legs with the head of a wolf. The greatest monsters are the ones who break sacred covenants and forget what they owe to those who serve them. The greatest evil is not transformation or strangeness or difference. The greatest evil is betrayal, is dishonoring those who trusted us, is abandoning our obligations when keeping them becomes inconvenient. The Dogman kept its word perfectly. Waldheim did not, and that is the shocking truth that was revealed. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.